Sorry about that, babe.
For many years, the artwork of Sword of Vermilion haunted my brain. It's just so iconic, perhaps in both the right and wrong ways. I remember thinking as a kid that it looked pretty freaking cool, then as an adolescent thinking it looked pretty lame, now maybe somewhat ironically as an adult, I think it's pretty sweet again. Anyways, this game's been sitting on my shelf for quite some time and I figured, let's give Sega some love and dive in. Sword of Vermilion is a role-playing game developed by Sega AM2 and published by Sega, released in North America in 1990 for the Sega Genesis. Perhaps the most notable person involved in the making of Sword of Vermilion is producer Yu Suzuki, who worked on a laundry list of titles, but most notably, in my opinion, the Shenmue series, as the director, producer, and writer, to help kind of give this game some odd perspective. The story. You know I don't like spoiling plot points in my reviews for those that haven't played, so let's keep it simple here. You assume the role of the son of Eric, the king of Excalibria. You are a warrior or swordsman now on a quest to defeat the evil Sarkhan, and in the process free the world of Vermilion. Throughout the journey you will learn of the various rings of power, the relationship between Eric and Sarkhan, and right from the jump you experience a pretty heavy plot point. Your journey will be perilous through many towns, dungeons, dealing with weird and shady circumstances, battling evil creatures, leveling and gearing up, learning auxiliary and attacking magic spells, and working your way eventually to the showdown with the evil Sarkhan. Before getting into the technical breakdown of Sword of Vermilion, I just wanted to say that I truly do applaud this game's creativity, in certain ways. The blending of various RPG styles, especially considering how early of a release this was, is very commendable. But with that being said, the graphics. Again, keeping this in perspective that this game was released in 1990 North America, you gotta hand it to the graphics. They're pretty good. Sure, Sword of Vermilion could be a bit bland in regards to the overworld and dungeons, but in general I kinda like the style. The overall drab tone that starts the game kinda permeates throughout and is enhanced by the graphics. You are about to go on a dreadful journey that's a bit heavy, not too cheerful or bright, and I find that the color palette and graphics match that pretty well. Clearly, the apex of the graphics are in the opening and closing cutscenes, and also in the extremely epic boss battles. I mean, just look at these. That's pretty sick. The NPCs can be a bit forgettable, the enemies, while repetitive, do have a pretty distinct style, and the magic spells are more than passable. Much like the RPG style mashup in the game and my thoughts on it in general, the graphics are a bit of a hodgepodge, but overall I do find that the good does outweigh the bad. Music and sound. Now, I will admit that I have a slight negative bias towards the sounds of the Genesis or Mega Drive, and that honestly I prefer the SNES sound chips. Now don't get me wrong, the Genesis does have some great soundtracks and tunes. I actually made a video of my top 10 favorite, but in general I do lean towards Nintendo here. That being said, Sword of Vermilion impressed me and borderline shocked me? Composer Hiroshi Kawaguchi did an excellent job of putting together a, quite frankly, banger of a soundtrack. Whether it be the high-paced intensity of the random encounter or boss music, the quirky offbeat tunes of certain towns, or the highly emotional and dramatic nature of tracks such as that of which you hear in the opening town of Wycliffe, just damn. This OST is pretty sweet. Now it's not all great, there's a track or two of course that can be forgettable, and I do find that some of the sound effects have that somewhat muffled Sega sound to it, but overall this was a pleasant surprise for me. Kudos here. Controls. At this point you're probably thinking, man, Bits is gonna give this a high score, isn't he? Well, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. The controls are the biggest technical aspect of Sword of Vermilion, which for lack of a better term, are lacking. I find them to be sluggish and janky. While in the town you control and move like a snail. On the overworld and dungeons, the controls as far as movement directions, they're basically inverted. If you play you'll know what I mean, and it can be very annoying. And while in the random encounter battles, I find the overall sluggishness and hit detection issues are on full display. The boss battles aren't too bad, but again, very slow and sluggish is the name of the game, and the hit detection is like you basically have no iframes in the boss battles, the bosses could just melt you in an instant. But I guess we could dive into that a little bit more deeper in the next section. Gameplay and fun factor. As always, this is the meat of the matter, so to speak, and with Sword of Vermilion being such an all-over-the-place type of game, I think that it would be wise to break it down with things that were good, things that were middling, and things that were bad. First up, the good. I really enjoyed the mix of RPG genres that were present in Sword of Vermilion. There's basically 4 things mashed together. The town exploration is fairly RPG standard, something that would look familiar to just about any RPG fan. But the random encounters take place on a bit of a semi-tilted perspective battlefield, where you duke it out with enemies in real time in an action RPG setting, which I found the combat to be somewhat engaging through most of the game. And then you have the dungeons in the overworld. It swaps over to a first-person perspective with a map to the side, if you find it, somewhat akin to a light dungeon crawler experience. And then finally you have the boss battles, which are also in the action RPG style, but are way more detailed and dramatized and more of a side-scrolling action nature. These boss battles are great spectacles and I enjoy them quite a bit, but there was a certain type of boss that you would encounter a few times throughout the game that I found to be very frustrating. Another great thing about Sword of Vermilion is that whenever I had to grind, I didn't really dread it. In fact, the further along that you went in the game, I found the grind got less and less grindy depending on your spells and the experience gained from certain enemies. The menuing of Sword of Vermilion was actually pretty easy to navigate, even with its archaic super early 90s nature. I also found there to be a decent amount of funny and weird moments in the game that kept things fresh within the story and town progression. And there were also a decent amount of questy or side questy elements within the game, especially towards the end with what I would dub the Gathering and the Secret Cave, giving some good variety to the home stretch. Now for the middling. Even though the menuing was easy to use and navigate, it doesn't mean that it wasn't slow as molasses. I learned late into my playthrough that you could change the dialogue box speed, but even with that set to fast, it's still pretty slow, let alone on the other two settings that were slower than a sloth. And I wasn't really expecting the second coming here, but I think it's safe to say that the dialogue and story in Sword of Vermilion are average at best. And lastly, the bad. The most glaring issue that I found with Sword of Vermilion is the random encounter frequency. Holy crap, there's a lot of these. There will be times where it seems like literally every move you make, even if it's just turning and not actually moving, bam, there's a fight. And the worst part is that you don't get a consistent way to avoid these encounters until way late with the in-audio spell, and even that's not great because it wears off so quickly. Coupled with the fact that you are able to level up so fast and likely will be maxed out before the end of the game, the encounters truly become useless and annoying down the home stretch, even more so than before. Sword of Vermilion also suffers from very repetitive gameplay cycles. The gist of it is, go to a town, get a map, go to a dungeon, return to the town, get another map, head to another town or dungeon, and just kind of repeat. Yes, lots of RPGs from this era are run-of-the-mill in this aspect, but you'll truly feel the repetitive grindiness of the game as you go along in Sword of Vermilion. Coupled with these gripes are also the repetitive enemy design. There's really only a few enemies present in Sword of Vermilion, including boss types. Throughout your journey, you will encounter tons of reskins where basically just the colors, speed, and attack patterns change. Thankfully, the attack patterns changing does give it some variety, but I would love to have seen some more different enemies throughout. And I touched on it earlier, how you could change the dialogue speed option, but at the end of the day, you can't change the walk speeds and general sluggish nature of the game. I've said it already like a million times, but it's just slow and sluggish. Not much else to be said. Conclusion. I truly do appreciate the ambition and mix of RPG genres that went into Sword of Vermilion. The journey has many high points, but lots of middling and annoying things going on throughout. I found Sword of Vermilion to be an overall enjoyable, ambitious, but very flawed experience. As such, I give Sword of Vermilion a 6.75 out of 10. If you're an RPG fan, I do recommend that you give it a go, but make sure that you temper your expectations about this title, especially given the fact that it is a relatively early RPG on the console. If you're an average RPG fan, meaning you don't like to play every single one of them, you might want to skip this. If you've enjoyed this review, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to check out in the pinned comment, description, or end screen here likely ways to view my first ever playthrough of Sword of Vermilion as well as an unboxing. Take care.